welcome. Today on the 22nd lecture, that is second lecture of week 5, let us discuss on the health and well-being. As you know, this is very important because finally it affects us. It affects when we talk about health and well-being, we are talking about the health and well-being of particularly the human health and human well-being. So in today's class, that is number 22nd, let us discuss what are the various observations which have been noticed across the world in general, and also what are the risks and the projected risks. So we will try to cover this with respect to these 6 concepts. So first is let us discuss about what are the observed impacts as far as the human health and well-being is concerned. Then we will discuss on the projected risk. So what are the various risks which has been projected using various climate scenarios. We all know SRES, RCPs and SSPs, and what are the various vulnerabilities or different vulnerabilities as far as the human health and well-being is concerned. Thirdly, we will talk about the impact of climate change on mental health. Friends, please look at this point. This has been picked as a separate heading because it has been more or less noticed that it has started impacting the human mental health, our mental health. It is also applicable to other animals also, but the mental health in general, how it is impacted because of the climate change. The fourth one is what are the various interactions between the climate induced hazards, exposure and vulnerability as far as the health and well-being are concerned. And fifth, we will try to discuss the various pathways that exist between the climate hazards and the waterborne diseases. Friends, we discussed in past week with respect to water related changes or water and hydrological risk and projection risk and adaptation. But today, with respect to the waterborne diseases and the pathway between this and the climate hazards, we will also try to discuss. We have picked it separately for our discussion today. And then we will try to understand the migration. The population is migrating, is shifting from one place to other so as to adapt to the climate or climate change related risk or vulnerability. So with these 6 points, we will cover or we will have an understanding of the various health and well-being are concerned in terms of observation, risk and projections. So the broad highlights are 4 major highlights. First is climate related illness, particularly premature deaths, malnutrition in all its forms, and threat to mental health and well-being are increasing. Very clear cut. So I'll repeat once again. Climate related illness, premature death, malnutrition, threat to mental health and well-being, everything is increasing because of which is climate induced or climate change induced. That's very clear. The second point is climate hazards are a growing driver of involuntary migration and displacement and are contributing factor to violent conflict. So 3 things have been clubbed here. One is because of this, the climate induced hazards, the migration and displacement is increasing, is happening at a more or a higher rate, and these also sometimes contributes to something called violent conflict. So if the people who are sitting in one place is moving to another place which is more suitable or suitable as far as the climate change related scenario, so there will be conflicts. There may be conflict may be of violent in nature. So that's the second point. Third is new evidence and awareness of current impact and projected risks of climate change on health, human well-being, migration and conflict has emerged, including greater evidence of detrimental impacts of climate change on mental health. It's very clear. So mental health has started affecting, and it has become extremely clear. The last point, the last broad point is the fourth point is climate resilient development has a strong potential to generate substantial co-benefits for health and well-being and to reduce risk of involuntary displacement and conflict. This particularly we will discuss in the next class, on class number 23 or lecture number 23, where we will see that if we introduce the climate resilient measures, then there is potential to generate or in terms of substantial co-benefits for health and well-being, and that will also reduce the risk in terms of the displacement or migration or various conflicts. So as far as the observations are concerned, in terms of the impact of the observed impacts are concerned, climate hazards are increasingly contributing to a growing number of adverse health outcomes. So what does it mean? That also include the communicable and non-communicable diseases, both CDs and NCDs, in multiple geographic areas, and this impact are largely becoming negative. Okay, so this is very clear that adverse health impact is there, and both the communicable and non-communicable diseases are increasing in multiple geographic areas, evidently. So this is the observation. The second is several chronic and non-communicable respiratory diseases. Look at the second point. First we talked about communicable and non-communicable. Now we are talking about the non-communicable respiratory diseases. They are climate sensitive because of their exposure pathways. The pathway what they follow, the exposure pathway they follow, that is heat, cold, dust, small particles, ozone, fire, smoke, allergens. So all these are influenced by climate change. So because of the exposure pathways, these respiratory non-communicable diseases or the several chronic diseases are increasing. So this is although climate change is not the dominant driver in all cases, though it may not be in all cases, but it is more or less contributing to increase in non-communicable respiratory diseases, that is through the exposure pathways, right? The third point is in terms of heat. So heat or the temperature, the heat is growing. It is a growing health risk due to burgeoning urbanization, which is increasing with respect to high temperature. So an increase in high temperature extremes and the demographic changes in countries with aging population. So demographic change and people where a lot of people are on a senior citizen people or aging population, there the health risk is high with respect to the increase in the higher or the upper temperature or the extreme temperature, higher or the temperature maxima, what you say. The fourth point is this leads, so climate variability and the change, this could contribute to food insecurity. Somewhere in previous classes we have discussed that it will affect the food, so there could be a food insecurity situation. Because of that, it will lead to malnutrition. It may also lead to undernutrition, overweight, obesity, and many other diseases that are susceptible in low and middle income group countries. So this is also indirectly induced by the impact of climate change. So let's say there will be a drought kind of situation, there will be a flood kind of situation. In either situations, it will affect the food production. So in a sense, it will lead to or it will push to a food insecurity situation. So that will ultimately lead to malnutrition, undernutrition, overweight, obesity, and all these things. So it is induced by the climate change or the climate variability. Then extreme climate events act both in terms of direct and indirect drivers, such as cyclones, very direct drivers, such as the rural income losses during prolonged droughts is a kind of indirect driver. So these things leads to mass migration or displacement. So extreme climate events leads to mass migration or what you say, displacement. So now let us see this apart from the observation, let us see what are the projections or the risks. The projected risks and vulnerability in terms of a significant increase in the ill health and premature death is projected due to climate change. Climate change is projected to increase the population exposure to heat waves and heat related morbidity and mortality. So if lot of exposure to that, then it will affect the ill health and it may lead to lot of exposure to heat wave will lead to morbidity and mortality kind of situation. And it has started happening, and it is also projected that in future scenario it will be more and more because temperature is rising, and we all have discussed with respect to the temperature rise 1.5 2 degrees centigrade and all this. The second point is the burdens of several climate sensitive food, water and vector-borne diseases called are projected to increase under the climate change situation. So because of the climate sensitive nature, the food-borne diseases, water-borne diseases, vector-borne diseases, all are projected to increase. It is pushing us to a very alarming situation because it concerns our health, our well-being. Then increase in the atmospheric CO2 concentration. We discuss CO2 as the representative of the greenhouse gases, because all of us know the impact of greenhouse gases in terms of rising the temperature of Earth. So increasing atmospheric CO2 concentration and climate change are projected to increase the diet-related risk factors and related non-communicable diseases globally, and increase undernutrition and stunting and related childhood mortality, with outcomes depending on the extent of mitigation and adaptation. So these all are very much linked. So it will lead to increase in the diet related risk, non-communicable diseases, and then undernutrition, and all this also will depend how much of mitigation and adaptation efforts we are putting. So if we are putting more of adaptation and mitigation efforts, then the effect could be a little less. So this all depends on how much we are careful and we are coming with respect to adaptation and mitigation. The climate change is expected to have adverse impacts on well-being and to further threaten the mental health. Future climate related migration is expected to vary by region. So it will vary from region to region. The climate change may increase susceptibility to violent conflict, primarily intrastate conflict. So within state there will be a lot of conflict by strengthening climate sensitive drivers of conflict. So we are going to discuss more on this. Look at the figure. This is a projected scenario. So projected exposure of poor people to floods and droughts by 2050, and the scenario what has been used is a very or a kind of pessimistic scenario, representative concentration pathway of 8.5 RCP. So on the left hand side, the legend is given, which is between minus 50% to plus 50% in terms of exposure increase by 2050 with respect to RCP 8.5 scenario. And the upper panel talks about the flood in 3 different regions in terms of Africa, Asia, and Central and South America. Look at our Indian subcontinent. You can very well see the flood level will increase from 25 to 50% for Bangladesh, and over Nepal it is over 5 to 15%, and then on the upper region you can also see similarly there is increase, or some are also shown there is decrease in terms of the projected exposure of poor people. And in terms of the drought, which is shown in the lower panel, similarly over Asia, Central Asia you can see, but importantly if we take Africa, both for the flood and the drought scenario, the situation is very alarming. we can see it is always touching the extremes in many places. So these kind of regional variations may happen in terms of the projected exposure of poor people to floods and droughts. And if we take similar projections ahead, the projected annual additional deaths to climate change in 2030 and 2050, I beg your pardon, this is 2050, just drop the middle 2 out of that 20 to 50. So it is 2030 to 2050 in comparison to 1961 to 1990. So look at over South Asia. The left, what you say, vertical histogram or vertical bar talks about the 2030 projected scenario in terms of the additional death in comparison to 1961 to 1990 scenario. And the right hand side talks about 2050 scenario, another 20 years ahead. And this is a cumulative bar diagram. So in vertical space, the green color talks about the undernutrition. Okay, so this much of death is predicted because of the undernutrition. The red is because of heat in elderly people. Next is the blue is for malaria or out of malaria diseases, and the orange on top is because of the diarrhea diseases in children under 15 years. So when these 5 aspects have been taken or have been put together, you get a projected figure of the loss in terms of what you say, the number or the additional death because of or in comparison to 1961 to 1980. So look at the scenario for various other countries, but what is the take home is the underdeveloped countries, particularly here you see the risk because of the West Africa, the South African countries, South Asian countries are higher, but nevertheless, if the red mark particularly hit in elderly people, the loss because of the hit in the elderly people are also there in terms of the East Asia and also the North America. So these are the things which have been a projected scenario in terms of additional deaths. So let us move on in terms of the pathways between climate hazard and waterborne diseases. So three things we have taken here. One is the cascading risk pathways from drought, from heavy rain and flooding, from increasing temperature. So in terms of drought, the first one, second one rain and flood, third one is the temperature. So let us see these 3 points. So first one is because of the drought, what are the cascading risk as far as the diseases are concerned? So low water availability, drought always gives us a water deficient situation. So low water availability augment travel distance to alternate sources, you can say contaminated sources. The intensified demand for and sharing, for example, with livestock of limited water resources decreases with availability and quality. The third point is poor hygiene due to decreased volume of source water and increased concentration of pathways. So these are the cascading risks which may be induced or which may happen because of the drought situation. So we are talking about the waterborne diseases. The second one is heavy rain and flood. The first drought is because of water deficient situation, and rain, flood, let us see, flood is a sufficiency situation, all of us know. So storm runoff. So the runoff because of the storm water yields water turbidity. So the water will turbid. So a lot of the turbid water which compromises water treatment efficiency. So water treatment efficiency will go down. So this may be more and more if you are having a heavy rain and a flooding situation, because it will have more turbid water in terms of the runoff. Then storm runoff and floods mobilize and transport pathogens. So this water, particularly the storm runoff and flood, they will mobilize and transport pathogen. All of us know during rainy season we catch a lot of cold, cough and all those things because the pathogens are well transported by by this water. So waterborne disease, we sometimes say that. So floods overwhelm contaminant system and discharge untreated wastewater. So what happens? So if you have a lot of flood, then the contaminant system also sometime will fail, similar to your water treatment efficiency. And then it will discharge a lot of untreated wastewater because you are beyond, you are on a higher amount, so sometime it will overwhelm. And then flood damage critical water supply and sanitation infrastructure. So it happens. So in this way, it leads to a lot of waterborne diseases. The third thing is because of the temperature rise. Let us see. Because of temperature rise, the extended transmission season for opportunistic pathogen. Let's say the malaria is we will start receiving here in this part of the country. We are on the nearly on the Tropic of Cancer, and as the temperature grow, we will start receiving a lot of mosquitoes. So the pathogens. So if for a larger duration we receive the if the higher temperature, then the pathogen or the opportunity pathogens will be there for a larger duration. So we say it is extended transmission season for them. Enhanced pathogen load in animal reservoirs such as chicken and others. So it will also affect that our food base also. Then pathogen survival and proliferation outside of the host. So these kind of situation will happen when we are receiving higher temperature. Look how they are affecting everything in totality. They are affecting the pathogen, opportunity pathogen, the pathogen load in animal reservoirs, and also the proliferation, survival and proliferation outside of the host. Now, let us take a situation. First, we talked about the waterborne diseases. Now, let us take as another example with respect to the climate-related migration. So, as we know, because of this, we have started observing evidently the shifting, displacement, or migration. So, temporary or seasonal migration, which frequently used as risk reduction strategy by rural households in less developed regions with highly seasonal precipitation. Right? This also include transhumance. Second, indefinite and permanent migration, less common than temporary or seasonal migration, particularly when the whole household permanently relocates. So this is second category. If the severity is very high, it is beyond adaptation or beyond continuing staying there, then you migrate permanently or indefinitely. Then coming to internal and international. In terms of internal, movement within state borders, most common form of climate related migration, because within state border you have many other things are also available to in terms of the political security, the medical security, or many things. So this is much common, but let us go with the international migration. So this is less common than the internal migration, because what happens most often occurs between contiguous countries. Sometimes if you have a land boundary shared between two nations, then it can be frequent. It can be you have a landmass and a perforated boundary. So there the movement is possible very frequently, but otherwise you need a visa and all those other compulsions minimizes this kind of migration. So often undertaken for purpose of earning wages to remit home. So people many times we know we move to other countries, we cross the international boundary if there is better opportunity, particularly for better livelihood, because we can earn there and send the money back home for survival of our relatives or family members. The rural urban and rural. This is extremely important because the movement from rural to urban and rural to rural, so typically internal, but may also flow between contiguous states. Maybe for temporary or indefinite periods, the migration may be undertaken by an individual household member, or the entire household may be followed by remittances. So in continuation, displacement, immobility, and planned and or organized resettlements. In terms of displacement, Households are forced to leave homes for temporary or indefinite period. Typically occurs as a result of extreme event. Let's say some cyclone has come. So the administration forces them that you move temporarily for 7 days. You have early warning system, and accordingly you allow or you ask them to move back at those places where it might affect the life and well-being. So that is one situation, and risk is expected to rise in most regions due to sea level change and associated coastal hazards and these things. So this kind of displacement might happen more frequently because of climate-induced extreme weather events. Then planned and or organized settlement. This is mostly initiated in areas where settlements become permanently uninhabitable, requires assistance from government and or institution, government-sponsored sedentarizations and pastoral population. Let's say some place become means you have a sea level rise, so this place becomes actually inhabitable. So it is unfit. It's unfit for the habitation to continue. So in that case, government sponsored movement or transfer or relocation happens. So that's a very planned and organized way we happen in terms of the response to the climate change. And immobility. So adverse weather or climate conditions warrant moving, but households are unable to relocate because of lack of resources or choose to remain because of strong social, economic and cultural attachments to place. So this also a kind of adverse weather or climate conditions, but it is if you cannot move, then because of the attachment, then it is a different situation, falls under the immobility criteria. So putting them together in terms of climate change impacts on mental health and adaptation responses. Look at here the 4 boxes or 4 rounds and the diagrams on the means upper right condition. So when we put the 5th one, the center one is the risk to mental health and well-being. So here we are going back to see that how the hazard, vulnerability, exposure and also the adaptation. So all 4. In terms of hazards, acute events and chronic changes. In terms of vulnerability, you have pre-existing health conditions, socioeconomic inequalities, gender, age and occupation. In terms of exposure, you have direct exposure, you have indirect exposure, and you also have a kind of vicarious exposure, very vivid exposure. And then on the other side, so these 3 are hazard, vulnerability and exposure. Then the other side, how much adaptation responses we have in place. In terms of scale of adaptation, it could be institutional, community and individuals. So in terms of institutional, the state and non-state actors participate. The local governments play an important role. In terms of community and individuals, the supports come from the social networks, the effective information channels, and in case of individuals, how aware you are, how prepared you are, and all those things. And then when we finally put together, we talk about 3 things. One is diminishing well-being, diminishing social relation, and diminishing, mental illness. So all this finally connect to the mental health and well-being in these 3 ways: mental illness and diminishing well-being and diminishing social relationships. So look at this, how the climate change impacts are impacts of mental health, and in terms of the adaptation response, how this can be slightly modulated. And now when we talk about the interactions, the interaction among hazard, exposure and vulnerability, the interaction is multifold. You see the hazards there, we have put the heat, drought, flood, storms and vector spread. In terms of vulnerability, age, gender, mobility, access to care, socioeconomic status, pre-existing conditions, characteristics of health system. In terms of exposure, I have put the outdoor employment, housing quality, local, location of the local geography, and the livelihood type. So these are the three groups in terms of hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. Now let us see the impact in terms of the climate sensitive outcomes and also the impact coming from the systems. So in terms of the climate sensitive outcomes, as we discussed, one is the adverse health, second is the migration displacement, and third is the conflict. I am not highlighting more on the conflict, but let us focus on the adverse health. So we talked about vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, foodborne diseases, infectious diseases, all heat-related illness, mental health, under and malnutrition. We also talked about migration and displacement. They will affect they will impact this vulnerable exposure and hazard in terms the risk, and it will also impact and also will be impacted by the the system. So health system, patient loads, in terms of emergency response and cost, all these things, food system, livelihood system. We have these systems, health, food, and livelihood system. So this system also will impact the climate sensitive outcomes and also will impact the risk. So this is the interactions between hazard, exposure, and vulnerability as far as as far as the health and the well-being are concerned. So when we put together in terms of the risk, and this risk you can very well correlate to the one we have recently passed in terms of COVID-19. So we can see hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and inadequate response. This lead to compound risk to pandemic and climate change. So none other than this group of people or us can imagine what happened during the pandemic and the risk because of the pandemic and the climate change. It's a kind of compound risk. So compound risk to pandemic and climate change can be put together in terms of health, in terms of hazard, vulnerability, inadequate response, and exposure. So for this we have picked the 7th chapter from 2022 report, working group 2, AR6 or assessment report, report 6, working group 2, 7th chapter. So 7th chapter is on health, well-being, and the changing structure of communities. So for all the figures have been picked there, majority of the points have been picked there, and for better reading or more understanding, or better understanding and more reading, you can look at this chapter, and the reference is this. So in turn, to conclude, we discussed risk, vulnerability, mental health, the waterborne diseases, and also the migration which are climate induced. Thank you very much.